Please note this podcast discusses real-life crimes and may include sensitive topics such as violence, abuse, and other disturbing content. We recommend listener discretion.
A Sunday afternoon, a barbecue at home, young girls playing. In that photograph, you can see the clock at 5:04 on that Sunday afternoon. It was 8 o'clock when Holly's parents discovered they were missing. By that time, they were already dead.
I'm journalist Helen Fosperoas.
I'm crime reporter Martin Brunt.
And this is True Criminals.
A journey into the darkest corners of the criminal underworld with insights from decades of true crime reporting.
The stories behind the stories, plus exclusive interviews with those closely involved in notorious cases.
Re-examining crimes so shocking they still haunt our imaginations.
In this episode, the disappearance on a summer's afternoon and double killing of 10-year-old schoolgirls and best friends Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman. This is the story of the Soham murders, which shocked the nation in 2002. We'll be looking back at the girls' disappearance, the huge police search and fraught investigation, and revealing how the case became pivotal in transforming policing and the safeguarding of children. The Soham murders, Martin, were a long time ago, but I've never forgotten the image on the front page of all the newspapers at the time of those two little girls wearing their Manchester United football shirts. Just remind us what happened.
It was a Sunday afternoon in the school holidays, the 4th of August in 2002, and Jessica Chapman had gone to her friend Holly Wells' family home for a barbecue, family barbecue. Both girls were 10 years old. The barbecue played out. The girls were upstairs playing in Holly's room. And at about 8 o'clock, Holly's mum went to see what the girls were up to and discovered they'd gone. They had no idea what had happened to them. It subsequently transpired that the girls had left the house without telling anybody, had gone to the local sports centre not far from Holly's house to get some sweets from a vending machine. And then they simply disappeared. Holly's family raised the alarm at about 10 o'clock that night, but by that time, the two girls were already dead. A huge search ensued, 400 police officers, many of them brought in from outside forces, from outside Cambridgeshire, and the search went on for a couple of weeks until, I think, on the 13th day, their bodies were discovered in a ditch beside Lakenheath Air Base.
You reported on Soham and the disappearance of Holly and Jessica, but your connection to the case runs deep, doesn't it?
It does. When the story broke, I don't suppose there were many people outside the community who even knew where Soham was, had probably never heard the name of this village. I knew it very well because I went to school there. In fact, I went to the very school where Ian Huntley, the man eventually convicted of the murders, was the school caretaker. A very different figure to the school caretaker I remember in my day at that school. I spent a lot of time on this story. I was on holiday when it broke. I came back and picked up the thread of the story, and I covered the early court appearances of Ian Huntley and Maxine Carr, his girlfriend. And I eventually covered the trial at the Old Bailey and the aftermath and those huge developments that were made in the future care of children and the appointment of people who were given jobs looking after children.
It's hard to imagine what their parents were going through on the days that ensued and the girls weren't found for almost a fortnight. Just describe to us what the police operation was like and how the police responded to these two little 10-year-olds being missing.
They didn't respond as well as they should have done. It took them a long time to establish what had happened. They probably still don't know exactly how they died, but even those reporters who were covering the story in the early days of the searches became aware of trouble within the search teams. The officer in charge of the hunt for the two girls had problems with his staff. there was an issue with the number of hours that officers were working. They were quite slow to respond on the first night. Everything seemed to have been parked overnight after the girls were found to have disappeared, and the search for them didn't really get going fully until the next day. And I think it's fair to say that the Cambridgeshire force was completely overwhelmed by the scale of the operation that eventually grew. And of course, at the same time, they were having to manage the huge media interest. I mean, this was a time of the emerging internet. Newspapers, TV, all had websites and were building audiences that wanted to know what had happened to these girls. It had happened in the school holidays, and for many of those people who followed the story, they could project themselves into the scenario. A Sunday afternoon, a barbecue at home, young girls playing, and perhaps the parents' eyes were taken off them for a while, and then the girls simply disappeared. But we could all imagine ourselves in that situation with the family barbecue. I think for that reason it resonated with people. And it's traditionally a very quiet time of the year for news. So for all of those reasons, it became a huge media story, and Cambridgeshire found it difficult to cope with the media interest. They had to call in press officers from other forces, principally Scotland Yard. So as time went on, the police came under increasing pressure to find what had happened to these two girls. And certainly as these things play out, the longer it went on, the more chance there was of it ending unhappily.
I suppose hopes were fading, and it did end up tragically. When and where were the girls' bodies eventually found?
They were found 13 days after they disappeared in a ditch about 10 miles away from Soham. Both bodies quite heavily decomposed. Remember, we're talking about the height of summer. And it was not far from the Lakenheath airbase. They were quite well hidden, but somebody walking in that area had discovered them. And then, of course, the police operation took on a new phase.
So how did the police track down and eventually identify Ian Huntley as the killer?
It took them a lot longer than it should have done. They tried to work out exactly what had happened to the girls. There were a number of people eventually who came forward and said they'd seen them. But among them, principally, was Ian Huntley, the caretaker of the local secondary school, who had lived near the school with his partner, Maxine Carr. And he initially told the police that he had seen the girls. They'd walked past his house and they had stopped. He was outside doing some cleaning, and they asked about Maxine Carr because she was a teaching assistant at their junior school. He had a brief conversation with them, he told the police, and then they walked off. So he quickly established himself perhaps as the last person who had seen them, at least the last person who had spoken to them. So he put himself at the centre of the story in a sense, and quite often the last person to see somebody alive who turns out later to have been murdered is often a prime suspect. He should have been identified as a suspect. He projected himself into the story. He was very keen to do media interviews, and he made a fuss of keeping in touch with the police. I mean, this is a very small community, so there were police all around, and he was a very visible figure. He'd talked to police officers involved in the search, and there were occasions when he asked them about how was their investigation going. And at one point he asked a police officer about the rate of decomposition of a body. These were rather strange things for somebody to be asking. And I think those were the kind of areas that police should have explored more, but they didn't. But principally, Huntley managed to evade arrest because of an alibi that was provided by Maxine Carr, his girlfriend. She said that she had been with Ian Huntley that afternoon and gave him an alibi that they were together in their house. And so for that reason, principally, police started looking elsewhere for a suspect and took their eyes off Ian Huntley. Of course, eventually, when there was a review of the lack of success of this operation after 10 days or so, a new senior investigating officer was appointed, and very quickly he identified Ian Huntley as a prime suspect. And within a day or so, he was arrested, his story unravelled, and he was charged with the murders.
I do remember that he seemed quite high profile at the time, I suppose because he'd been one of the last people to see the girls. He was required to do interviews for the press. I think one of your colleagues from Sky News interviewed him, and he got involved in media appeals for their safe return. He was quite a big presence, wasn't he, in the search for them?
He was clearly seeking attention, and he would walk up to TV crews and say, look, would you like to interview me? And of course, TV crews wanted to. Everybody wanted to interview him. We knew by then, because of what he'd said, that he was perhaps the last person to have seen them. My colleague Jeremy Thompson on Sky News actually interviewed him live on air. In fact, Jeremy subsequently gave evidence at the Old Bailey trial about that interview. And in it, Huntley seemed to suggest that in some way it was his fault because if he'd kept the girls talking after their brief exchange, according to him outside the house, then perhaps what happened to them wouldn't have happened. It was almost as though, in a very small way, he was blaming himself for their disappearance, which is a weird thing for him to do at that stage.
And he also started to speculate, didn't he, about how the girls might have reacted to a stranger abducting them?
Yes, I mean, he differentiated between the two, saying that Jessica would have reacted in this way, Holly would perhaps have had another reaction. And it was just a very odd thing for him to talk about them being abducted, because of course at that stage, although the suspicion was they'd been abducted, they could have been the victims of some kind of bizarre accident. He didn't know on the face of it at that stage what had happened to them, but of course subsequently it was proved that he did know very well.
Maxine Carr, his girlfriend, worked as a teaching assistant at their school. You say that she gave Huntley an alibi for the evening of the girls' disappearance, which means perhaps that slowed down them arresting him. What did she tell police?
Maxine Carr told police that she had been with Ian Huntley that afternoon and he clearly hadn't been involved in anything to do with the girls' disappearance. The truth was that she wasn't in Soham at all. She was many miles away in Grimsby, where she and Huntley grew up. She was staying with her mother. But by giving him an alibi, it deflected police and they spent an awful lot of time looking for other potential suspects and effectively had eliminated Ian Huntley for any potential list of suspects. She subsequently said that she gave him this false alibi because he'd told her he had nothing to do with it and she believed him. She also felt that perhaps police were showing an interest in him initially because she knew that he had some years earlier been accused falsely, in her view, of a rape in Grimsby. So when he said to her, look, they're targeting me because of something that I was accused of once before, she had a lot of sympathy and went along with the idea of giving him a false alibi. Of course, we know subsequently that she was living under Huntley's control. He was a very controlling figure. She was a rather sad figure with a troubled childhood herself. She was somebody who enjoyed having a firm relationship and didn't want anything to jeopardise that. So for a number of reasons, she was quite happy to concoct this alibi.
As you know, Martin, I'm from Grimsby, like Huntley and Carr. So I remember that this was not only a big national story for me, but it was a very big local story for us. And I remember people commenting that Maxine Carr had looked less and less credible in a TV interview when she spoke fondly of the girls, but then referred to them in the past tense.
Yes, I mean, that was quite marked and lots of people picked up on it. She said that nobody believes they would ever run away. They were very close to their families. This is something that I will keep for the rest of my life. Those were the kind of things that she was saying in interviews, and a lot of people listened to that and thought she's talking about them in the past tense as though she knows that they're not going to be found alive. And it was all part of, I suppose, that net closing in on her and Ian Huntley.
And it did close in around them on August the 16th, which just for timeline purposes was day 12 of the police search and the day before the bodies were found.
There was more and more circumstantial evidence that was building up against Ian Huntley. When the police examined one of the girls, Jessica's mobile phone, they discovered that it had been turned off outside Huntley's home. I mean, this was the sort of forensic investigation that police were beginning to do by matching phones with masts. They could tell what the phones had been up to, and it clearly was established that her phone had stopped working outside Huntley's home. When they searched Huntley's house and the school grounds where he worked, they found that certain areas had been cleaned meticulously. He'd cleaned out his car. They discovered that he'd changed the tyres on his car. They discovered, and this was a key thing, the burnt remains of some of the girls' clothes in a bin not far from the school, in a hangar. All of that led police to start believing very strongly that the girls hadn't gone far from that area around Huntley's house. And of course, because of that, he became a much more serious candidate as a suspect.
And when the girls' burnt clothes were unearthed, isn't that the moment when Maxine Carr fell apart and quickly confessed that she had actually lied and given a false alibi?
I think she recognised that their story, one that she had helped fabricate, was falling apart. And then, of course, the two of them were arrested, and she did explain to police why she had given Huntley a false alibi.
And did Huntley cooperate with the police at this point?
No, he behaved very oddly with the police. He, in his youth, had had problems with mental health issues. He'd suffered from depression. And he gave the impression to the police during that first period of arrest that he had similar problems now. He was actually sent to a mental health institution for a psychological assessment, and it was established that he was fit enough to be interviewed by the police as a suspect. But it was the forensic detail that finally did for him. Fibres from the girls' clothes were found in his house, and also there were fingerprints of his over that bin where the charred remains of the clothing was found. In a huge operation, police even managed to find the old tyres he'd taken off his car. And there was evidence on those tyres of pollen that police were able to tie in with the deposition site, the ditch where the bodies were found. And there was something else that was an extraordinary feature of this police investigation. There was a botanist called Patricia Wiltshire who actually studied the pollen that was found from the car and was able to match it with that area of the ditch where the bodies were found. And not only that, she studied the nettles that were growing up in the ditch, and she was able to tell police by studying the nettles and seeing where they had been tramped down and then regrown over 2 or 3 weeks, exactly the path the killer had taken to deposit the bodies in the ditch. So all of this came together to lead to Huntley being charged with the murders.
The forensics are just mind-blowing on cases like this, aren't they?
It's usually the forensics that do for you. Sometimes, of course, even in quite violent murders, the killer manages to leave no forensics, or the forensic clues are eroded through weather, or a killer can be quite lucky. But Huntley hadn't made a lot of effort. I mean, he'd tried to clean up his house, he'd tried to clean up his car. But then again, people came forward and said we'd seen him cleaning the car. We know that he'd done a lot of cleaning of the house. And it didn't fit with this man whose girlfriend was away for a few days, taking that opportunity to do some spring cleaning. It just didn't fit. And of course, you can clean as much as you like, but it's very, very difficult to get rid of all the clues that might lead to your downfall. And that's what happened. And fibres from the girls' clothes were in the house, and he obviously didn't get rid of those. In addition to co-hosting True Criminals, Helen hosts her own award-winning podcast, The Convex Conversation. If you're eager to learn more about the inspiring guests she interviews, from royalty to astronauts, from industry leaders to explorers, check it out at convex.podbean.com or search The Convex Conversation on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to yours.
And if you're curious to dive deeper into Martin's work as a crime reporter, I had the pleasure of interviewing him about his book, No One Got Cracked Over the Head for No Reason, Dispatches from a Crime Reporter, on my podcast. In this episode, Martin shares some gripping stories that resonate with the themes we explore here on True Criminals. You can find links to that episode in our show notes or on the True Criminals page at audiobleachglobal.com. According to Maxine Carr, his girlfriend, Huntley had said that the children came into their home because Holly had had a nosebleed and that Jessica had sat on their bed while he helped Holly control the bleeding. Did we ever get to the bottom? Did he ever confess what had happened or give any indication of how they died?
the pathologist never established exactly how the girls had died. They think probably through asphyxia, but their bodies were so decomposed in the heat of the summer after 2 weeks that those kind of details just were impossible to establish. Ian Huntley told 3 different stories about his contact with the girls. He said originally that they had been walking past his house, they'd stopped to chat and they'd asked about Maxine. Is Maxine in the house? Because they knew her, of course, and liked her as a teaching assistant at their junior school. He says it was a very brief conversation and Maxine wasn't there, and so they walked on. He later told Maxine that the girls had gone into the house because Holly had had a nosebleed and he'd taken her and Jessica into the house to help her stem the blood, and then the girls left. When it came to his trial, having continued to deny any involvement in their deaths, he suddenly, and this was a very dramatic moment, and I was covering the case at the Old Bailey, he suddenly came up with a third version of what had happened. And he said that the 2 girls had been walking past, Holly had a nosebleed, he invited them in to help them. He took them into the bathroom, where the bath was already full of water because he'd been washing the dog. And in his efforts to stem the nosebleed, he'd accidentally knocked Holly into the bath, and in his panic to try and get her out of the bath, she drowned. Now, that was extraordinary and a preposterous story for anybody to believe. He compounded it by saying that, having witnessed this, Jessica started screaming, and to stop her screaming, he put his hands over her mouth, and then suddenly she died through lack of air. And that was his defence. So halfway through the trial, he acknowledged that, yes, they had died in the house and it was all an accident, a terrible accident. Both the girls had died accidentally.
The case was tried at the Old Bailey. What did the jury make of Huntley's version of events?
Well, there was this whole raft of evidence, the forensics, the stories that he and Maxine told and then changed. I don't think there was much doubt in the jury's mind. I mean, there were gaps in the evidence, as there always are. I mean, the police couldn't point to what they felt was conclusive, incontrovertible evidence, but there was enough to convince the jury, and he was convicted of 2 murders. Maxine was convicted on one of the charges she faced, perverting the course of justice, and this was all about that false alibi she had given Huntley, but she was acquitted on the second charge of assisting an offender. So the jury, it seemed, had some sympathy with Maxine, and I think there was a genuine argument that she had perhaps been the victim in a way of Huntley's controlling nature and had been in fear of him and had been cajoled into giving him that false alibi. But she did get quite a hefty sentence, 3.5 years. He, of course, was jailed for life.
And with any chance of parole, or does life mean life in Huntley's case?
No, he does have a chance of parole in principle. At a subsequent court hearing, he was given a minimum term of 40 years. So in 2042, he can apply for parole. That doesn't mean he's going to get it, and I think it's probably unlikely that he would. He would have to convince the parole board that he's safe and of no threat to children. But of course, a lot of the evidence against him, the psychological evidence, was that he was a predatory paedophile, a latent predatory paedophile at least, who used the opportunity of the girls walking past to grab them and kill them. Whether he raped them, sexually interfered with them, again, that's an unanswered question because of the decomposition of the bodies. So there's an awful lot, I think, that will go against him if he survives to 2042 and if he does ask for parole.
In which prison is he at, and do we ever hear anything of him these days?
As far as we know, he's still in Franklin prison in Durham, which is a high-security prison, and we do hear something of him from time to time. Stories leak out. Prisoners who leave prison tell journalists their experiences, and some of them tell the relationship that they've had, but more often and of more interest to journalists are the stories of Huntley being attacked by other prisoners. I mean, he's clearly a prime target as a child killer for other prisoners. He has been attacked a number of times quite seriously, and he's also, we're told, attempted to take his own life. And he has said in leaked interviews in the past that he thought that he probably wouldn't survive his time in prison. Maybe he will, maybe he won't.
Maxine Carr was sentenced to 3.5 years, as you said, for perverting the course of justice, and served 21 months of that initial 42-month sentence. But she was released, wasn't she, in 2004. What's happened to her after that?
It's very difficult to know exactly what's happened to her. We know she was released. We know that she was granted anonymity, lifelong anonymity and a new identity. And she's one of only 4 ex-prisoners who've been granted that. And it's granted in very extreme circumstances when the authorities are clearly convinced that she is such a pariah, such a hate figure for an awful lot of people, that she deserves some kind of protection. And I think that also implies that there is perhaps some understanding that she was under Huntley's control, and that's why she committed the offences and backed up his story and gave him a false alibi. From time to time, media stories emerge that suggest where she is living and something of her life now. And from time to time, she does have to get moved from wherever she's living. It has been reported that she's had a child and she has a partner, may even be married. But even if I did know the name she was living under at the moment, I wouldn't be allowed, no journalist would be allowed to publish it because of this rather unusual anonymity order that she's living under. I mean, Mary Bell, a notorious child killer from the 60s, is also subject to that anonymous order. So too the 2 young killers, as they were at the time of James Bulger in Liverpool. Those 2 killers still are granted anonymity by the law.
It's such a disturbing story, Martin. I mean, 2 10-year-old schoolgirls heading off to buy sweets on a Sunday afternoon, murdered, perhaps so horrific and shocking that the case did lead to some positive change in the hope that nothing like this could happen again.
It did. It led to huge changes in the way people are appointed when they apply for jobs that involve contact with children. I mean, there were a number of reviews, a public inquiry into what had happened, and there were big issues for 2 police forces. I mean, the biggest issue, of course, was how Ian Huntley ever came to be given a job at a school, because although he had no previous convictions for anything to do with children, no sex offences, he had come under a suspicion several times in Humberside when he was living in Grimsby a few years before the murders of Jessica and Holly. And Humberside police had on their records a number of investigations that had been carried out where he'd been thought to be a suspect for a number of sex attacks. None of them ever led to a charge, but there was information on Humberside police files that he had been a suspect. The files weren't as complete as they should have been. And Humberside did subsequently say, well, under the law, they had to remove information that they'd assembled on Ian Huntley because he was never charged. That wasn't quite true. They were shown to have kept very poor records. Equally, Cambridgeshire police had not done the checks that perhaps they should have done when Huntley applied for the job. They should have gone to Humberside and asked, is there anything known? But in those days, unless you had a criminal record, suspicions, intelligence about somebody was not routinely passed between police forces. Both police forces were heavily castigated in the official public inquiry, the Bishard report. But of the 2 forces, it was Humberside that came in for the more severe criticism, and it led to the Chief Constable having to resign. But the things that also came out of it was the establishing of much tighter checks on the Criminal Records Bureau, more thorough vetting of individuals who were applying to work with children, and great changes in how schools and other institutions handle child protection, a greater awareness of the work that needs to be done, the care that needs to be shown when appointing people, anybody in any field who's asking to work with children.
And what came out of that Bishard inquiry was the police national database, wasn't it, to ensure that convicts and also suspects couldn't hide across county borders. I think it was launched in 2011. That must have been a very welcome step, and also the creation of that database very welcome for the girls' parents.
Yes, I mean, there was already established the Police National Computer, which recorded details of convictions. The issue here was a lot was suspected about Huntley in Humberside before he moved to Cambridgeshire. And where was that information stored? And it was revealed because of the inquiries that Humberside did have some record of those investigations that led nowhere, but they didn't have full records. So the establishment of the Police National Database kind of created a new database of of what you would call soft intelligence, not hard facts about previous convictions, but information about investigations that had been done into individuals but hadn't led to convictions. And, of course, police forces were, from that day, encouraged to talk more fully to each other. I mean, it's one of the symptoms of having 43 separate police forces, as we do in England and Wales. And there have long been, since then, arguments for having bigger regional police forces where information will readily be shared between different geographical areas. We still have 43 police forces, but the Bichard report did lead to police forces not only being asked to share, but recognising the desperate need to talk to one another and share this kind of information.
I think Holly and Jessica's parents described it as a defining moment and said that they hoped that the database's use will mean that other families don't suffer the same loss and heartbreak as we did. That story really did grip the nation, didn't it, Martin, in terms of particularly if you're a parent, and we've all had those moments where perhaps at a barbecue in the afternoon and perhaps you haven't got your eye on everybody. And, I lost my son once for a few minutes in Hyde Park, and I will never forget my heart was beating outside of my body until we found him, and everybody thought everybody else was looking after him, and then the next thing he disappeared for a few minutes. But I suppose the whole nation came behind this story because we could all feel the pain of the parents, couldn't we?
I think there are lots of reasons why this became such a huge media story. We've talked about the time it happened during the school holidays. That made it resonate with all parents. But you're right. I mean, I've gone through this. You turn around and suddenly the little child has gone. And almost all of us, of course, very quickly find that missing child. You can't imagine how that awful feeling gets prolonged in a case like this. Holly's parents checking at 8 o'clock that night to see if the girls were still in Holly's bedroom, discovering that they weren't, and then trying to work out what had happened to them. I mean, this is 2002. The girls were only 10. There was no way they could instantly find out where they were. And of course, it took another 2 hours for them to realise that there was a huge problem and alert the police. These are the vital moments, the golden hour. So time was lost. I mean, they can't even be sure what time the girls left the house. One of the other reasons, I think, why this story became such a big media story, it was that image of the two girls in their Manchester United shirts. Holly was wearing her own, Jessica was wearing Holly's brother's, but it was a very vivid, the bright red of the United shirts. It was a very vivid image of these two very pretty little girls looking very vulnerable, smiling at the camera, who simply vanished into thin air. And little girls don't vanish into thin air. There had to be a reason for their disappearance. And one other thing I think that struck some of us was that in that photograph, you can see the clock at 5:04 on that Sunday afternoon. It was 8 o'clock when Holly's parents discovered they were missing. By that time, they were already dead. Police were able to establish that by about 6:45, they think the two girls had been murdered.
So that photograph was actually taken the day they went missing. I didn't realise that.
It was a photograph that was taken during the barbecue, and because it showed the girls as they looked on that day, was used by police in their appeals. And it was such a striking image. The vivid red, the two pretty, vulnerable schoolgirls who had vanished. And it became the abiding image of that police investigation. And, of course, was something that, for journalists like me and you, it was the image that was used at the very end of the investigation with the conviction of Huntley and Carr. And then ever since, in the documentaries and the films that have been made ever since.
It's the image that will always stay with me. I was just thinking back to the episode we did on Fred and Rose West, and the stories of all those young women who disappeared without trace back in the 70s. And with these changes to databases and police intelligence, it does feel like perhaps there's been a big step forward since then, and that the Soham murders played an important part in that.
Yes, I think it's very difficult to draw analogies between the two cases, other than these were vulnerable females who went missing. I think more than anything, it was the age at which Holly and Jessica vanished. They were 10 years old. They were clearly not girls who could fend for themselves, as the victims of Fred and Rose West had left home and hitchhiked around the country and so forth and embarked on the early years of young womanhood. These girls were clearly vulnerable. Within an hour or so of their disappearance, if they hadn't been located, alarm bells started ringing. And police were much more attuned by then, 2002, to understand that these weren't simply missing people. There was, even early on, a concern that something awful had happened to them.
And Martin, of course, you went to the same school many years earlier where Huntley was the caretaker. That must have been quite a strange connection for you, was it?
It was rather weird. I hadn't been back to the school. It was a boys' grammar school in my day. It had since become a secondary modern school. I hadn't been back for 30 years. And I was chosen amongst the pool of reporters covering the Old Bailey trial to go with the jury. The jury wanted to go and visit the scene and just to look at the layout and so forth to help them formulate their views. So I went along with them, following in their trail. And the first place we went to was the school assembly hall, where Ian Huntley, as the caretaker, had set out the chairs every morning for school assembly and even helped organise the press conferences that were held in the same room. It was quite bizarre. I mean, it looked much the same as I remembered it. But we were also shown the bin where the charred remains of the clothing were found, where Ian Huntley had burned their clothes. But I also went back again a few years later. I was invited to an old boys reunion lunch. And I thought I'd go because, my interest in the school had been rekindled because of this case. But the really weird thing about going back for the lunch was that a lot of those people I was with, my old pupils, knew exactly who I was, my job, and of course knew that I'd been back there to cover this dreadful story. But nobody mentioned it. And I thought, well, if they're not going to mention it, maybe I shouldn't. Maybe it's still a bit uncomfortable. And what it showed me was that for all people's fascination with true crime and their dwelling on the detail, even of the most gory details, when those stories get very close to home, they shut down.
Hey listeners, True Criminals is a new show and your support means everything to us. If you're enjoying the podcast, please take a moment to leave us a review. It helps us grow, reach new listeners, and keep bringing you the stories you love. This episode is brought to you by Audio Bleach Global. Our senior producer is Russell Barnes, with mixing by Andrew Chappell. The original score was composed by Chapman, artwork by Bleached, executive produced by Lee Mann. Follow True Criminals on Instagram at true.criminals and on YouTube at youtube.com/@true-criminals. For exclusive content and ways to support the show, visit us at patreon.com/True Criminals. For partnership opportunities, please contact us at contact@audiobleachglobal.com.